Hello, and thanks for joining me. I hope that today I have something of a treat for you in that I'm tasting a mature Saint-Émilion Grand Cru from the 2010 vintage. The wine I'm looking at is a wine called Canon La Gaffeliere, 2010, an excellent vintage. Now, Canon La Gaffeliere is now a very well regarded property from Saint-Émilion, and the chateau has become known for the elegance, the refinement and the opulence of the really quite modern style of Saint-Émilion wines that it now makes. However, that wasn't the case when its current owners, the Von Neipperg family, purchased the estate at a knockdown price back in 1971. I think maybe the 2010 vintage is quite an important illustration of the improvements that went on at this estate over the following 40 years. Because in 2013, this vintage of this wine was placed at number 2 by Wine-Spectator, the American wine magazine, on their top 100 wines for the year. So going back a bit in history, during the 19th century, evidently this comprised 2 estates, Canon Boitard and La Gaffeliere Boitard. And it was at that stage that these wines were combined. As I say, it was in 1971 that Count Joseph Von Neipperg, from a winemaking family in Wurttenburg in southern Germany, acquired this property along with a number of others at a time of economic downturn in Bordeaux, when these properties were very well priced. Count Joseph did invest significantly in improving the cuverie. However, he rarely visited the estates and left its running in the hands of a manager. However, the current proprietor, the colourful character that is Count Stephan von Neipperg, one of Joseph's sons, came to Bordeaux in 1985 to take over the running of the estate. Along with Canon La Gaffeliere, he also owns and runs a number of other estates, such as La Mondotte, Clos Loretoire, and Chateau Canon in Saint-Émilion, and also has some other properties throughout Bordeaux. Stephan von Neipperg was an enthusiastic modernizer and took a risk in engaging an unknown wine consultant, somebody called Stéphane Derenoncourt, who is now acknowledged as one of the leading wine consultants in the region, but at the time was more or less unknown and was dismissed for being a self-taught winemaker. But Stephan von Neipperg took him on as a consultant for Chateau Canon La Gaffeliere in 1996. Results weren't instant, but in 2012, 2 years after this wine was made, the wine was promoted from Saint-Émilion Grand Cru status to that of Saint-Émilion Premier Grand Cru Classe, Class B. Now, the estate and the chateau lie just south of the town of Saint-Émilion, and the vineyards here sit on the beginnings of the slope where they come down to meet the plateau. It's not far from Chateau La Gaffeliere, and it's close to the railway line. Looking up the hill from portions of Chateau Canon La Gaffeliere, you can actually see Chateau Ozone. The soils here are a mix of clay limestone and clay and sand, and both of these predominantly have sandy topsoils. And these soil types suit the varieties that are planted here. Planting in the vineyards is roughly 50% Merlot with 40% Cabernet Franc and 10% of Cabernet Sauvignon. And the average vine age here is quite an impressive 50 years, ensuring that the majority of the fruit here is coming off low-yielding, mature vines. One of Stephan von Neipperg's first innovations here was to move to sustainable farming. For example, soils here are regularly ploughed as a means of weed control, but also to ensure there's aeration. However, this has to be done carefully because to avoid mixing the different layers of topsoil, only quite light, shallow ploughing takes place. So it was from 1988 that the estate started to focus not only on sustainable, but also on environmentally responsible viticultural practices. In fact, in 2006, they actually appointed somebody with the position of overseeing ecological practices. And I know it's subsequent to the production of this wine, but Chateau Canon La Gaffeliere has been certified as organic since 2014. However, I think we can be sure that in 2010 they were working towards that goal. Now, 2010 was a truly great vintage for Bordeaux. Everything seemed to fall together really nicely for the winemakers. A cold winter delayed the initial vine growth and slowed the onset of budburst and flowering. And at that stage there were problems with millerondage and collure, especially amongst Merlot, and that cut down yield significantly. A wet June gave a damp start to summer. However, the season very quickly heated up, turning exceedingly hot and dry. The arid conditions resulted in water stress that was sufficient to concentrate the berries, yet didn't cause the vines to shut down completely. Gentle September rain came and refreshed the vines, and then wonderful long sunny days continued through October, giving a long ripening season. However, by that stage there were cool nights that were sufficient to preserve the acidity in the fruit. So to put that in a nutshell, the initial dry conditions concentrated the fruit. Cooling nights and rains later in the season helped preserve acidity that would keep the wines fresh. And finally, the long growing season enabled the vines to fully ripen the tannins. So what resulted were structured wines with ripe fruit and good supporting acidity. Harvest came quite late. At Canon La Gaffeliere it started on the 5th of October and finished on the 20th. And yields were down at just 28 hectolitres per hectare. When it came to winemaking, harvest here is done entirely by hand. Everything is picked into shallow baskets, or cagettes as they're called, just to make sure that the fruit isn't broken or bruised as it goes into the winery. There was a process of double sorting went on. First of all, the bunches were sorted, then they were destemmed, and then the individual berries were sorted again, ensuring that no damaged, undersized, underripe, or even overripe fruit made its way into the fermenting vat. But the berries themselves weren't actually crushed in this process. Fruit was moved gently on conveyor belts to try and make sure it wasn't damaged in this process, and actually went into the vats where it underwent a pre-fermentation maceration at cool temperature, with the idea of extracting colours and perfumes and flavours at a stage of winemaking before there's alcohol present, so that you can more gently draw these things out. Fermentation went on in wooden vats, but with temperature control to prevent too much extraction, and extraction was managed by a system of pneumatic pigeage, so a machine being used to push the cap of skins back into the fermenting must and wine. Maceration was allowed to go on for 32 days in 2010, and then the wine was run off into barrel to do its malolactic fermentation in 225 litre French oak barriques. And part of the style of Canon La Gaffeliere is to use a reasonable amount of new oak. That helps sort of provide an opulence. And in 2010, 70% of the barrels used were new. The blend in 2010 comprised 55% of Merlot, with 35% of Cabernet Franc and 10% of Cabernet Sauvignon. And the wine stayed in barrel, again those French oak barriques, 70% of them new, for a period of 17 months, which is a reasonably long time to age that kind of wine. It will start giving you oak flavour and supplementing the fruit tannins, as well as giving a gentle oxidation to help fix colours and tannins in the wine. The oxidative effects of the barrel in 2010 were also supplemented by the use of microbullage, or micro-oxidation, the bubbling of a fine stream of oxygen through the barrels, enabling them to replicate one of the effects of racking, but to just give a gentle, regular stream of oxygen through the wine. It helps to give and reinforce the sort of the chocolatey richness that you get through having done the malolactic conversion in the barrel. There was no fining or filtration done to the 2010 vintage of this wine, which was bottled at the Chateau in April 2012. And in total, there were just 4,500 cases of this wine made. That's coming off a 19.5 hectare vineyard. So I think that demonstrates that yields were quite low in 2010. So let's take a look at the wine, shall we? First thing to say is that although this wine is 15 years old, it is still deep, dark, and it's holding its colour, which has a sort of a black element to it, a black-red element, almost to the rim. There is the slightest oranginess there, but there really is an intensity. The wine is still opaque. I can't see the stem of the glass as I look down through the wine. Swelling it, the wine is labelled as having 14.5% alcohol, and you can really see it's quite dense, quite viscous, so that will be the combination of the alcohol and the tannins here. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are mature, they're ripe, they're really quite hedonistic. There is a quite heady, rich, dark red plum note with overtones of prunes, bright, ripe red cherry to black cherry. Then sitting behind that, there's a really attractive vanilla note. There is also a lovely, clean, developed note of blood orange sitting there. Something wonderfully high toned, sort of sitting slightly between a note of cedar and another note of vanilla. It's very enticing, and all of this is beautifully harmoniously combined. There's an impressive intensity, there's a lovely clarity of fruit, and a wonderful complexity. I'm still picking up more towards the end of the nose. There are hints of licorice, there are hints of raisins. And again, that beautifully defined note of blood orange. So let's have a taste, shall we? There's a richness and a ripeness to the palate. I was talking earlier about dark cherries, dark red cherries, black cherries, and there's a sort of a smooth, rounded glycerol texture there that makes me think about those. As the palate opens up, you start to see more of that cedar and perhaps a hint of vanilla. Again, those hints of blood orange are just bridging between those two elements. There's something wonderfully mouth-watering about it. The cedary oak is showing as notes of cinnamon. There's almost an underlying gingeriness. It doesn't stand out because of the ripeness of the fruit overlaying it, but there really is an underlying fresh, mouth-watering acidity, and that's playing against some very fine cedary tannins from the oak. Those tannins are helping to give a long, fine finish that has notes of coffee. We're coming back to those red plum notes, almost at the freshness of spicy raspberry notes on the finish. Yet across a rich mid-palate, there's quite a licoricey density. This is a really nice example of what I see as a modern Bordeaux. It's got rich, ripe fruit that's balancing a generous structure. This is full-bodied. The ripe fruit is helping to balance that 14.5% alcohol. Currently, that doesn't particularly stand out as being hot, but it is helping to emphasize some cinnamon and nutmeg sweet spice notes on the back palate. In terms of the wine's aging, I've seen a suggestion this is a wine whose drinking window will extend out to about 2045, and I can certainly see there's enough tannin here for this wine to last and for those tannins to continue to soften and become silky, whereas currently they're velvety and sit beautifully alongside that juicy, opulent, dark cherry and dark plum fruit. I find this an exciting wine, and I do wish I had more in my cellar because I can see it still has the potential to continue to develop in the bottle. You can understand entirely it ended up with such a high ranking on the Wine-Spectator Top 100 wines, and you can see that with the production of wines like this, Chateau Canon La Gaffeliere truly earned its promotion to Premier Grand Cru Classe status 2 vintages later in 2012. It's a very impressive wine. I'm actually a little surprised to see that its Wine Searcher aggregated critics score is just down at 93 out of 100. I would be rating this as a 94 at least, possibly even a 95. And I would note that there are plenty of other critics that do. I think one of Robert Parker's Wine Advocate scores for this wine is at least 96. So thank you very much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, it would be fantastic if you could press that like button. If you're watching these videos and you haven't yet subscribed, it would be great if you could consider doing that. Subscribing, leaving comments, liking these videos all helps my channel to grow and to be seen more widely on YouTube. Similarly, if you have friends you think might like to watch this video, please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. And if you have any comments, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Do please pop them in the comments box below. To help you find this wine or to find out more about this wine, I'll leave a link in the comments box to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of Canon La Gaffeliere, and you can see if that's available in your market and at what price. So thank you once again for watching, and I do hope that maybe you'll take the time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.